Canada has been one of the top choices for immigrants for the longest of time. For instance, look at this graph. This is taken from a paper published by the University of Alberta, and you can clearly see that Canada has had immigrants at least for the last 100 years. But if you fast forward to today, things have changed slightly. On one side, there's a pretty strong sentiment among locals that immigration has ruined the country. On the other hand, aspiring immigrants don't see Canada as a good option anymore. So between a history of embracing immigration for the last 100 years to today, where did things really go wrong? In this video, I wanted to share some of the things that I've learned through my curiosity over the internet and what I think it means for Canada and immigrants in the coming years. But to understand Canada's immigration system today, we need to go back a bit. We need to go back to a time when immigration really began. We need to go back to 1867. You see, in 1867, Canada had just become a country through the Constitution Act, and this was a major step forward. The Constitution Act united provinces under one government, gave Canada control over its own economy, and set the stage for expansion. But there was a big problem. You see, Canada's economy at that point in time was heavily reliant on natural resource industries like fishing, lumber, and the fur trade. And while these industries were significant at that point in time, they had their own limitations. For example, fishing was vulnerable to overfishing. Lumber wasn't just really scalable for the future, and the fur trade was already in decline. The economy really needed diversification and the introduction of a new industry that could help Canada grow. And luckily for Canada, the solution was right there. You see, Canada had vast amounts of land, especially in the West, that was ideal for farming. And farming was already a growing industry globally. So if somehow Canada could turn its vast prairies into productive farmlands, Canada could build a strong economy for years to come. But there was another challenge in doing that. You see, Canada's population at that point in time was only about 3.5 million people. And most of them lived in eastern parts of the country, including the regions of Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. The rest of the country was basically just empty. Vast stretches of fertile land, but no farmers to really cultivate it. And that's where immigration first came in. It was a way to bring in thousands of settlers who could farm the land, grow the economy, and basically secure Canada's western territories. So in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Canada launched one of the biggest immigration campaigns the world has ever seen. The government began actively recruiting farmers, laborers, and settlers from Europe. And for many of those people, it was an offer they couldn't really refuse. You see, that was because Europe at that time wasn't particularly doing too well. There was a lot of political instability, crowding in cities, and a lot of people were looking for a better life. And here was a country in the West that was just offering it all for free. It was a win-win. So by the early 1900s, thousands of immigrants arrived. They were mostly Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, and Scandinavians. And as they arrived, as a part of the Dominion Lands Act, they were given large plots of land to farm as long as they agreed to develop and live on it for a few years. And slowly, Canada's prairies transformed. Towns and villages started appearing, railways were built to bring people into the markets, and within a few decades, farming had become the backbone of Canadian economy. And it was immigration that helped achieve that. And while Canada's immigration policy in the late 1800s and the early 1900s seemed quite welcoming, but the reality was somewhat different. You see, these policies were only welcoming for a certain subset of people who were in Europe. If you were from that part of the world and you could farm, Canada would accept you with open arms. But if you were from East Africa, Asia, or other non-European countries, Canada didn't really want you. The immigration rules at that point in time were carefully crafted to keep Canada as a white European nation. For example, there was this Chinese head tax of 1885. When Chinese workers came to build Canada's railways, they were welcomed. But once the railways were complete, Canada saw them as a problem. So the government introduced a head tax, charging every Chinese immigrant a fee to just enter the country. At first it was about $50, it increased to $100 in some years, and then finally it was about $500, which was equivalent to 2 years of wages for these workers at that point in time. And when that wasn't enough to stop Chinese immigration, Canada passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1923. which would ban all Chinese immigrations for 24 years to come. And not just this, there's another example, the Komagata Maru incident. In 1914, a ship called Komagata Maru arrived in Vancouver, carrying about 376 passengers from British India, almost all of them Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims. But since Canada didn't really want them based on their skin color, the government used a legal loophole, the Continuous Journey Regulation, a rule designed specifically to block immigration from India. So for 2 months, these passengers were stranded on the ship, denied food, water, and even medical care. Eventually, the ship was forced to turn back to India, and when it arrived in Calcutta, the British police opened fire, killing about 20 of the passengers and injuring dozens of them. And this is how Canada's immigration system had stayed for a few decades up until the 1960s. You see, what happened was after World War II, Canada started to face pressure from both within and from the international community to change its discriminatory policies. The world was moving toward human rights, equality, and decolonization. And one thing was pretty clear. If Canada wanted to be a modern, respected nation, it had to fix its discriminatory immigration laws. And to do that, the government introduced the point-based immigration system in 1967. It was a new way of evaluating immigrants based on their skills, education, and their experience, rather than their race or their country of origin. And as a result, Canada saw waves of new immigrants from Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Africa. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal transformed into multicultural hubs. And in a little time, a country that feared diversity became a country that embraced it and was kind of built on it. So now that you have context on how immigration started and how it evolved through the years in Canada, you must be thinking, why does Canada really accept new immigrants today? Clearly, Canada doesn't need any new farmers. The population has grown and things are quite stable. Well, there's a number of reasons. But the most important of them all is the fact that Canada's population is aging. More people are retiring than are entering the workforce. For example, look at this graph. This graph clearly shows the trend of the median age in Canada. You can clearly see that it's trending upwards. And that's a huge problem because it threatens the amount of tax dollars the government will collect over the years. Think about it for a second. Fewer workers mean less income tax, and less income tax means less funding for the programs like healthcare and pensions, which will be increasing, by the way, as years come, as these aged workers in the population will be retiring. So to keep the system running smoothly, Canada has to constantly bring new people in, as it helps to grow the workforce and keep the economy strong. But here's where things get interesting. You see, if you accept too few people, you run the risk of slowing the economy down. But if you accept too many people, you run the risk of causing chaos and overloading the system. And that's a pretty fine balance where you have to manage your long-term goals and your short-term situation. And this is where the current Liberal government made a mistake. You see, when they came into power in 2015, they built their whole campaign around inclusivity and economic diversification. And after they came into the office, they ramped up immigration slowly at first, but pretty aggressively soon after. You see, in the immigration levels plan, the government aimed to welcome about 431,000 new permanent residents in 2022, about 447,000 in 2023, and about 451,000 in 2024, which was a pretty aggressive plan to even begin with. And on top of that, in 2022, the government surpassed its target by admitting over 437,000 new permanent residents, marking the highest number of immigrants the country had brought in per year since the last 100 years. And this number didn't even include the international students and the temporary workers that had came into the country as well. And as a result, rent prices skyrocketed because there weren't enough homes for all of these newcomers. Healthcare was overwhelmed because hospitals and clinics struggled to keep up with demand. And the job market simply became too competitive, where either you didn't get a job, or if you did get a job, you were underpaid grossly. And suddenly what was meant to be a boost of Canada's economy started to feel like a crisis. And at first, the Liberal government justified these increased immigration targets by emphasizing the aging population and labor shortages, and calling these side effects as merely a temporary setback. But as anti-immigration sentiment rose among the locals, the government had to revise its immigration targets by decreasing the plan for 2025 from 485,000 to about 397,000, with even further reductions planned for subsequent years. And on top of that, the fact that most of the people the Trudeau government has let in the recent years has majorly been Indian has sparked the debate whether just bringing people from one country is even diversity or inclusion or not. But here's one thing that everyone needs to understand. Remember back when in 1867, Canada had to bring in European farmers that weren't in a good financial situation back then? It's pretty much the same situation now. It's just that the only ethnicity that's willing to start again after leaving everything behind is Indians. They're the only ones willing to come in after leaving their homes and contribute to Canada's economy and increase the tax revenue. And fortunately or unfortunately, that's Canada's reality. It's just basic supply and demand. And while it does make sense to only bring in people based on merit, and being an Indian, I'm all in for it. But if people want to argue who should be let in or not based on the color or which part of the world they come from, wouldn't that take Canada back to 150 years? After all, Canada's immigration system hasn't been just about numbers and policies. It's also been about who gets a chance at a new life and who doesn't.